Welcome to the Grid Mod Pod, brought to you by AEIC. In this podcast, you'll hear from the utility industry's top operations leaders on how their companies are working to modernize and improve our ever-evolving power grid. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks again for showing up. This is going to be an exciting topic. I was really looking forward to this interview because I think you're going to have an amazing set of perspectives and kind of nuggets of wisdom to share. So, hello listeners, welcome to another episode of the Grid Mod Pod. Today we have Aftab, who's going to introduce himself and kind of share his background. But today we have done a lot of episodes on the distribution system, which I think has a big part of this transformation of the grid as a whole. So for you that have listened a bunch of times, we talk about generation, transmission, distribution, and the edge. Distribution, the edge really grab the focus of the grid modernization, but I believe it's really, we have to look at the full system from an integrated system plan. So with that, I'm going to have you jump, because we're going to talk about transmission today for all of you. So I'm going to have you jump in and introduce yourself, and then we'll get rolling on our topics of interest.
Yeah, well, first, thanks, Liz, for having me. I'm Aftab Khan. I am the Executive Vice President of Operations, Planning, and Security, both physical cybersecurity here at PJM. For those of you who aren't familiar with PJM, we are the largest regional transmission organization in the country. We serve 65 million people in parts of 13 states and District of Columbia. So we do three main things for the bulk power system behind the scenes. A lot of people don't realize what we're doing because they deal with their local utility company. But behind the scenes, we operate the bulk power system, which means we dispatch generation. We direct the transmission system control to ensure that we get supply and demand balance every minute of every day. We do long-term regional planning of the transmission system to ensure that we look ahead and build out the transmission system for what we need in the future. And we also operate wholesale energy markets. So we ensure that markets send the right price signals for generators to invest in their facilities and provide resource adequacy on the system. So I've been with PJM for a short time now, about 6 months, and I spent my whole career, though, in the utility industry, both T&D side of the grid world.
And I think I'm just going to jump with PJM, the existence of and the entity that you've become has been a realization of the complexities of our grid as a whole. So just like when I started my career, it was in transmission as well, and it was kind of, as I like to say, my first love. And as you're working in it, you find yourself working within a system, but then what you start to realize is the transmission grid itself, we've tied to a lot of other systems. This has been like my big word of the years, like system thinking, because I don't think we're like taught a whole logical process of thinking about what does it mean to be a system within a system. So anyway, what PJM I thought was interesting, I had the privilege to travel all across the states, sitting within the planning organizations of all the RTO ISOs, which PJM is one of, the set that are under NERC, lots of acronyms. So for all of you, get your notes out. But PJM really is the one that's helping to facilitate this massive networked system that we've created over time based on safety, reliability, and just all of the needs the transmission has had. So it's such a large system, but I think as the external populations looking from the outside in, that there's this partnership and realization that the PJM itself is a service provider to the members of PJM. So when I became the senior manager of transmission planning in a utility, I learned a whole lot more about how PJM is facilitating and helping the overall operation of the bulk collector system. So I'm very excited to have you here and hear about where you guys are at, and especially around, I think this is the hot topic when it comes to what's happening on the transmission. However, I feel like we're having like whiplash, right? Each year it's like a new topic, but I feel like this topic's here to stay. So how is PJM as a whole addressing this increasing demand for the capacity that's going to be driven by data centers? So let's dive in a little bit there. I think that would be a great topic to start with.
Yeah, no, that's a great question and definitely a top of mind issue for us at PJM. I would say there's a few areas that we're really focused on strengthening our capabilities, our system to deal with this growth. So I'll start with the transmission side of the world. So I kind of mentioned we do the long-term regional transmission planning of the system. Obviously, that starts with the load forecast. So every year we refresh the load forecast, we develop models, we do all the studies looking at what's going on, not only with load, but what's been going on with generation retirements and generation changes on the system, look at all the reliability issues, and then we, depending on the time frame of issues, we'll go through a competitive solicitation of solutions to address a lot of transmission needs. So just to give an example, late last year, the PJM board approved close to $6 billion of transmission investment to address all those factors. But the two main things that we were addressing there, we had about 7,500 megawatts of data center load in Northern Virginia, Data Center Alley, and into Maryland. We also had about 11,000 megawatts of generator retirements in the same time periods that we were modeling. So between load addition, generator retirements, mix changes, that's what led to a pretty large transmission need and award of transmission projects. Now we're going through the same process right now, which starts with the load forecast, starting to see some changes. Stay tuned because we're going to be publishing some of those results, but initial indications I have is that it just keeps increasing, the load forecast, mainly data centers. And so we expect that there will be another round of transmission needs to address that. The other area that obviously is very important is the supply side. So we obviously need generation to meet that demand. And our primary vehicle for inducing or incenting the investment in generation is the markets. So our capacity market, which is the forward-looking market that sends that price signal for investment, hit a record high price in the last capacity auction mid this year. And although that caused a lot of concern about rate impact, which I think is a very valid concern, but that is what supply and demand economics say will happen. If you have a shortage of supply, market prices will go up to kind of incent that investment. So we feel like our markets are doing its job to send the right price signals. I guess I'll just pause there, Liz, because, that was like both the transmission generation side. See if you had any more questions on that. So.
Yeah, and I guess just from like a relativity perspective. So when you said 11,000 megawatts?
That's right. Yeah.
So when we compare that, that's like Los Angeles or New York, or maybe even like, Houston. So if you think about big cities require that amount of load you're seeing. And so when we think about the generation to meet that type of demand, we're talking about a large amount of generation that's required. So, I mean, it seems obvious, but when you put it in like kind of like that amount and then thinking about the time it has taken to serve the load that we have today, let alone what's coming in this very short term period. So but you can keep going. So
No, I think that's a great point, right? And I think it's not only the magnitude of the loads that we're talking about, it's the pace of change. It's happening very fast. So it's very large, very fast, which is really testing the mechanisms that we have to ensure resource adequacy at the end of the day. Because utilities, and we are actually technically utility too as PJM under FERC, we are obligated to serve load. That obligation to serve, I think, is a core principle of any utility. So we approach it from that mindset. But there's definitely a concern that we have about future resource adequacy. And we actually raised the issue prior to a lot of this data center boom a couple years back. We were actually concerned that there were federal, state policies, private company policies, really accelerating a clean energy transition. And we're not against the energy transition. We want to support it. Our only message was that it's happening at a fast pace and it's putting pressure on fossil fuel generation that we rely on today quite heavily for resource adequacy. So if we have a mismatch between when resources are coming online and resources that are retiring faster than what's coming online, that's not a good scenario for ensuring resource adequacy. So we kind of raised that issue a couple of years back, and we remain concerned about that. And then now on top of that, we have this rapid load growth. So definitely is I think, a significant challenge for the industry. I think on the positive side, I think the data center community is recognizing the impact that they're having and there seems to be more dialogue going on about how they can work with us to address their need and ensure resource adequacy for everybody.
And I think just like grounding a lot of what you said is, the systems that we've built have been based on the needs and the drivers of a time that was before. And so in all space of progress, you really truly have to understand the processes that are in place to be able to then start to pull the threads to drive change in the various space. And so just like thinking like when the grid first evolved, there was only a certain set of energy resources and capabilities that was available. And we spent like 80 years developing the technology to increase the size of our machines to create the most efficient amount of electricity. And that tapped out around the 70s and 80s. And then we just went status quo. And so I think on top of everything that you just said, and this is just me kind of throwing this idea out here and you can pull on it, is we got in a space of complacency, or it worked, especially went into the space of reducing our energy. So for the last 40 years, it's all about energy efficiency and kind of leveling off that increase. So now on top of all that's happening, not only do we have new energy resources available, such as new technology that could effectively be a part of the solution. When you say 11,000 megawatts, you need kind of the whole span. You need the gas plants, you need the solar, you need the battery storage, you need the nuclear plants, you need the hydro, you need it kind of all. And having now all of those ingredients just makes it much more complex. So like 11,000 megawatts is like a significant project. I think a lot of things that come up in, is that queue of studying the interconnection and how do we manage and really understand which projects are go and which projects are behind, right? And so now, though, what you said is data centers are now starting to see if they want to be served, instead of just being the askers and then the takers, they need to be a partner because the systems that we've created really no longer fit the asks that are being demanded. I don't know. That's kind of like where my headspace is. Like we're in this like pivotal moment of how we see and work through these very complex problems, and we're going to need partnerships and new ways of processing this massive amount of opportunity in front of us.
Yeah,
So I
no, I
get,
think, yeah, I agree. This is like an unprecedented, and I know through history, like you said, power system had really grown dramatically at certain periods. But I think when you really take a look at the types of generation, the characteristics of generation, I think it's quite different than what's really in our interconnection queue today. And I didn't necessarily touch on that yet, but we have quite a lot of resources actually in the interconnection queue. So, but the problem is that a lot of those resources are intermittent, variable, or limited duration kind of batteries, which, again, we welcome any energy source onto the system, but they definitely have a different characteristic than the resources that we're used to having. And that's another complexity that we need to just deal with as far as how we operate the grid with different kind of resources. I think it's all manageable, but it just needs to be done in a coordinated, controlled way, because I think it's obvious if just load comes in without the resource to serve it, there's just supply and demand fundamentals that will create an issue for reliability for everybody, not just the data centers. So it does need like fresh thinking, creative approaches. And the thing I'm encouraged about is I think the dialogue on this is getting escalated. FERC actually has a technical conference. I think it's more specific on co-located loads, but again, data centers that have co-located with some nuclear plants or want to co-locate with nuclear plants. So I feel like the issue in general is getting a lot more attention. So I'm optimistic that we'll find the way forward on this.
right. And just those words that you just put together is like such a shift in where our headspace was 5 years ago, right? Like co-locating load next to nuclear plants and rethinking our whole nuclear fleet is, coming into focus and, an exciting time. And I guess I was leading towards, in a lot of that is with the interconnection queue, the load demand, the generation demand, the complexity of those different sources, understanding them, studying them, having the people to understand them, learn them, and then really then putting on the grid is two big moments, right? And then in between is a lot of invested energy of people and then just the ability of knowing, okay, this works. And I think a lot of us lose sight of that time span is very different than the time span that we're being driven from this enormous demand. So what I think, and what keeps me like excited is there's a space where, and it's an oxymoron or maybe a catch-22, data analytics and how we can develop the models and run these heavily computational analyses to kind of pull us through. And then also there's other grid enhancing technologies that are becoming available that were not available. So, how is PJM kind of thinking about leveraging data analytics and these new technologies that are becoming available that could help us in the short term, midterm kind of planning perspective?
Yeah, no, great question. So I would say when it comes to data, people may not realize, but we deal with a tremendous amount of data as an industry, but PJM in particular, I would say we're in the range of 500,000 data points that from generators from the transmission system coming into PJM every few seconds. And then we also have phaser measurement units, which are GPS synchronized measurements across system. We probably have a few thousand called PMU, phaser measurement systems, and those are collecting data 30 points per second. So
which is
tremendous amount of data
less
coming
than
in
a
from
molecular
PMUs.
eye.
Yeah,
Much-
exactly. And so we use that data and continue to refine and enhance the basically tools for operators to take decisions on the system. But at the end of the day, I believe PJM is no different than a lot of companies in the utility industry. I think we're just scratching the surface of what we can do with that data. I use PMUs as an example. I think there's potentially a lot more we can do with the PMU data that we just haven't figured out yet. And so I think some innovation in applications of PMU data, I think it would be a great opportunity for us, particularly a region the size of PJM with the diversity of everything that we're dealing with. I think that's a future opportunity for us. You mentioned grid enhancing technologies. I think that's another area that's been getting a lot of attention because when you look at how difficult it is, I mean, we're at the end of the day, we're going to need new transmission infrastructure, just given the magnitude of what we're dealing with. But we also know that it's getting harder and harder to build that infrastructure. I think eventually things get built, but there's a longer and longer process to get things built, depending on where you're building transmission. So for that reason alone, I think any technology like grid enhancing technologies that can leverage the existing infrastructure and just try to get more out of it, I think is going to help. And I think we're just in the mode of like all of the above. So even though you're going to need infrastructure, let's leverage GETS. Let's leverage, there's Order 2222 with kind of DER aggregation and participation in wholesale markets is another opportunity. Like anything we can do to, meet the supply, meet the transmission needs, I think we're just going to have to think out of the box and explore all opportunities to ensure at the end of the day, resource adequacy for everybody and reliability.
And so I don't know if you're an avid listener, but any avid listeners out there know that like the data strategy and really that complexity of the framework that not only does a PJM, but an individual entity that owns assets that deliver electrons. We're in this space now where, historically how the grid operated, it was very pragmatic and siloed, right? You had your generation, your transmission, your distribution, and your very predictable customers. And so I think what's happening and really why data analytics and GETS and all of these other really data-driven type technologies could be really a path forward because as you just, we will need new transmission. I think the national study just came out. They're saying 2.4 times. Some studies saying 4 times the transmission needs to be built. And that's with all of this new advanced technology to understand. So I don't want to eliminate the idea that we don't need to build new. But what's happening is those siloed organizations are now realizing the value of sharing those data sources across each other. And then because we have this extremely powerful computational availability, because of the evolution of our computers and how data talks to each other and how it can interact with each other, and then ultimately make predictive analytics to really drive insight to create impact, is that's what you're kind of seeing with, we're at the tip of that. And so as we've all seen, that technology will expedite, but staying, so it's kind of, I think, brings hope to me that we will, very large amount of resources are with bright minds are at working on this problem. It's just very complex. So I think unraveling those disparate data sets and then bringing them together really can kind of enable. So it's great to hear that PJM's also in that space driving that forward. So I guess, my next question is, and really for those on the outside looking in, there's a large amount of stakeholders now involved. So when you think about from a hierarchical perspective, you have your distribution grid, usually, regulated by your state commission, but that ties into your transmission grid. And so you mentioned FERC Order 2222. So like the idea that something on the distribution grids could play a part in the solution of transmission now brings those stakeholders together in a gray space that we have to figure out. Then you have your transmission grids that go across state lines. So now you have a federally regulated system. So now you have another regulatory body. And then PJM, as we mentioned, really in the 70s and 80s, all these transmission grids realized they're too big to fail. So let's start connecting to each other as a backup, a reliability purpose. And with that, we're like, we need someone to oversee all of this interconnection. So now you have that layer. So that's just like 5-6 layers, I think I just mentioned, right? From a perspective. So I think in your core is the idea of being collaborative. So what collaborative efforts, are being made between the PJM, the utilities, and really these data center operators? I know you mentioned something about the FERC technical conference, but just specific to like what you all are doing.
Sure. So I would say several areas, but one area has been how we do load forecasting. So PJM traditionally did a bottoms-up load forecast that we developed on our own. So, we have metered load of all regions in PJM. So we would take that metered load and we would use econometric data, whether it's S&P Global and other data sources, to look at different sector growth, residential or commercial industrial, even electrification. There's data sources that project in different parts of the country, like electrification of transportation. So we were pretty much doing our own kind of development of a load forecast with minimal input, I would say, we would review it through the stakeholder community, but we were kind of developing it on our own. And there was a part of that forecasting process, which is called a large load addition, where if there were, let's say, a brand new chip factory or something very significant that would not come in through a normal, just econometric kind of data source, that we would take as input and refine our load forecast. Well, now, obviously, with data centers, how we do the whole large load adjustment process and our load forecast is changing dramatically. And I think that's been an area where there's been great collaboration with our, refer to them as transmission owner zones that are responsible for giving us that input, particularly around data centers. There's different people have different approaches. Like I'll give an example that in the Dominion zone, so Dominion Energy obviously has seen a lot of this data center growth. They have one way that they can now project what's coming. There's other places like in Ohio and Indiana, a little bit newer to the large data center additions, that have a little bit of a different way on how they address it in terms of a forecast. So that's been, I would say, a big focus area for us. The other area, obviously, is engaging with the data center community themselves. And there's a data center coalition. We've been engaging there and trying to raise some awareness around what some of our challenges are, and also try to explore where there's some load flexibility on the part of data centers. Is there a way that they can be, for example, a first priority load reduction if we got into an emergency, so that we can balance that very large load coming on the system, but also kind of not have other people suffer from any potential resource adequacy issues? So there's just a couple examples, I'd say, where we're engaging to manage this. Obviously, and I touched on FERC. FERC is now involved in this co-location issue. So we expect FERC to provide some guidance and direction on how we may want to handle those situations. So there are a number of, I would say, different activities going on.
Well, what I kind of heard there is the term GEB got my attention a few years ago, grid interactive efficient buildings. I think it could be data centers and the operators thereof could be a big component to show not only how this large building of energy consumption, can maybe carve out and really pave the way for the power of the idea that buildings themselves can be a part of the solution. And what I mean by that is like, incorporating the advanced energy efficiency measures that are now available. And I think data centers themselves, there's a huge drive to make them more efficient in general. Like that's not happening. It's just where we are today and where we need to go. And then that grid interaction, so that demand flexibility that you just spoke about, that we can send signals based on the bulk grid to the building and they can do like synergistic, like a partnership engagement, not like a demand. It's more or less like this is where we're sitting at this moment in time. How do we work together? And then and you kind of said with the co-location, it's not really a DER because if you're co-locating with a nuclear plant, but the idea that the building itself can have its own energy source tied in. So it's like the whole gamut, right? On a very large scale from a transmission. And so I guess I just like to share and like connect the dots that a lot of the big asks boil down to some fundamental knowns that we all have had, but haven't had access to the data, the ability to convert it, right? Pull it, convert it, analyze it, and then provide it out to all the groups. And that is rapidly evolving as along with everything else. So it's very exciting.
It is. And like you said, I think these data centers, they run, a lot of them run like 24/7, very high load factor. But to your point, I think, we are starting to hear that depending on who it is, like cloud provider or AI kind of load, it sounds like there is some flexibility that they could shift processing loads to different locations. I don't think it's something they want to do like every day, but there's some, like to your point, different kinds of flexibility that, could be explored. So I think that's just, and to your point, with the right data and coordination, I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
I just want to give another tidbit. When you say data, like PJM, if you think about all of your members, and then you said like 500,000 nodes, right? Don't quote us, listeners, but the idea of that amount. And then when we talk about the amount, the latency, so how often it comes, how quickly, we're talking massive amount of data. And then the fact that we're able even to do that over the last 10, 20, 30 years, I feel like just also shows the power that we can do hard things. It's all kind of coming together from a very, really, we probably right now quickly, which I won't list, like 9 initiatives that are driving almost the same action, which is, we need to optimize how we're operating the grid. So it really does start with what are we providing and creating for the operators, and then that whole back to the planning. And then I just see it. I bet you see it too.
Yeah, no, I think again, good point. We got a lot of great infrastructure and capabilities today, as I said, like hundreds of thousands of data points from generators, the transmission system, and we have the thousands of PMUs. So there is a tremendous amount of data, and I think the operator tools and capabilities have really evolved. But I think there's a lot more potential there, particularly when you think about as I kind of touched on, the kinds of resources that we expect to get built out on the system, the intermittent renewable generation, battery systems. There's, I think, a lot of opportunity for us to do more with those inverter-based resources.
And just for clarification, because load forecasting is also my jam, you said your metered points, but I would say you're more or less coming from the transmission distribution metered, we don't have all members don't actually have smart meters, like all the way down to the edge. And so there is probably a progress where that bottoms up from the edge to that nodal that you guys get then to your forecast. So there's like an evolution in that space as well. But the distribution nodes ultimately have to mature to a space to get that. So like it can even get more accurate and more intelligent as time evolves.
It really could. And, when I said meter points, for us, it's metered from the bulk power system. So we would know, like, into a certain transmission zone, how much load is being served. But to your point, the granularity down to the distribution system is not something we have visibility to. And so when I say all of the above approach, just another example, if there could be more widespread deployment of smart meters and perhaps rate designs that incent energy usage at certain times of the day. I know it's sometimes not a popular concept, depending on where you are, but when I said all of the above, I think that these are all things that need to be explored. And I think to your earlier comment, it's distribution system up through the transmission system. It's like the lines are getting blurred in terms of how we think about resource adequacy, because it may no longer be just like a large generation on transmission. I mean, that'll definitely be, I think, part of it, but how we manage distributed resources, because there's more and more of them on the distribution system, I think that all has to play in together.
Yeah. And that's kind of the basis of this podcast, is really just, I have been in the space, now 20 years, and really the rapid expansion, but there's so much tremendous, innovative, creative, actionable work happening in the electric utility space that I don't think, well, one, it's not easy to communicate because it's very complex, but to know that, these large leaders are really actively pursuing this framework, and we're doing it together, which is one uncommon thing about large industries, is like the knowledge of one is the knowledge of all, because like we are in these, geographical monopolistic space, but how the grid works and the fundamentals of the grid are all the same. So there's so much that we can share and really plant seeds in my world to the next generation of workforce and leaders of like, it is possible. There are solutions for this transformation we're going through, and we all need to be working together. So with that, I'm going to wrap up and just, as someone who has led in this really evolving and complex space, what piece of wisdom or lesson learned would you want to share with, your future utility employees or the current ones in preparing to take on this transformation we're talking about?
Yeah, I would say that sometimes our industry gets a negative rap for staying status quo, which I don't think is true, but I think we've been accused of that. And I would encourage anyone getting involved in the industry, or if you've been in the industry, just given everything that we've talked through in this podcast, we need to think out of the box. We need to be creative. Obviously, ensuring reliability, safety and reliability will remain priority one, but that doesn't mean that we can't innovate and we can't evolve. We just obviously need to do things the right way, but we need to be creative, and approaches that we've taken in the past may not work for the future. So that would probably be my main message, just to be creative, think out of the box, challenge status quo. And I think we can meet the challenges of the future.
Love it. And I just have to say two things because you said that. One, that type of leadership and the language is very new to the power system engineering space, in the last 20 years. So it's time for us that understand it to be the creative thought leaders. So, and then also your quote, working to perfect the flow of energy. I love, especially in my space, is realizing, the flow of electrical energy is very important, but to make that happen is really perfecting us as beings, and really how do we manage our own energy for this large transformation we're going through. So I love that quote. I think it resonates. And I want to thank you again for showing up and really sharing your wisdom and just all the things that PJM, actively you're doing. You're embracing the data analytics. You're seeing grid-enhanced technology as opportunity. You understand that data centers are an important part of this complex load forecasting issue, and you're being collaborative. So thank you again, and look forward to being in this journey with you as we transform the grid.
Great. Thanks for having me.
That's a wrap for this week's episode of the Grid Mod Pod. Thanks for tuning in. We hope today's conversation got you thinking about new and creative ways to improve our power grid. be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to be the first to hear new episodes. This podcast is brought to you by AEIC, the place where operations leaders come together to share knowledge and provide guidance to the electric utility industry. We'll be back with a new episode soon. Until then, keep powering on.